This video is brought to you by Squarespace, an all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. Hello, my spider monkeys. Wait, did I just say spider monkey? Not me being in a twilight state of mind.
You better hold on tight, spider monkey.
Oh my gosh. Okay, flying monkey, redo. Hello, hello, my beautiful flying monkeys. You notice this background is not my usual background. Once again, I am not at home because actually I just moved out of my apartment a couple weeks ago. I've moved out of New York City. I've been kind of like edging this for a long time, but I wanted to wait until my lease was up, and it was December 1st. So now I've been kind of just like bumping around. This is not my place. I'm still looking for a permanent situation, and hopefully it won't take that much longer. Hopefully next time I'll have like a more decorated space, but bear with me during this trying time. So today I want to talk about Wicked. As a disclaimer, I'm incredibly biased when it comes to musicals, but I'm trying to go about this in the fairest way that I can. I'm like clenching my fists as I say this because I just like it's impossible for me to have a bad time if I'm watching people sing and dance and perform and, you know, the whole hoopla. I love musicals.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Musicals just scratch a totally different part of my brain in the way that like Marvel movies scratch the balls for a certain demographic of men. They elicit a purely pleasurable experience for me.
Can I say, I love the theater.
Even if I don't think the plot makes that much sense, or if I think the characters are kind of underdeveloped, it won't mess with my enjoyment of the musical movie, which is why, on a base, primal level, I controversially loved Wonka, and I stand by it.
I'm making chocolate, of course.
And on a base, primal level, I also loved Wicked. It's not my favorite musical by any means, and I'm receptive to people's criticisms against it. I've read a bunch of like negative reviews. And yes, I agree with some points. Like I think the fascism allegory has always seemed kind of half-baked in the same way that Zootopia is kind of half-baked in its racism allegory. And yes, I thought the first part dragged a bit while the ending was rushed. And yes, I do think its commentary on what it means to be good and evil is confusing and messy. But to be fair, it's also confusing and messy in the book is based on. In the end, I am a simple woman, and when I see Jonathan Bailey do the theater kid smirk and dancing through life, and when I hear Cynthia Erivo sing literally anything, and when I see beautiful, ridiculously ornate costumes, I just transcend onto a higher plane. I've also seen this musical before on stage, and so I knew what to expect when it came to the story and music. I actually also posted a short review of the original book on TikTok and Instagram recently if you're interested. The only thing I was actually hesitant about going into the movie was the visuals. And this is because for months leading up to the movie's premiere, so many people were complaining about the color grading.
Some people have complaints about the colors.
It's hideous.
Why does Wicked look terrible?
It looks bland, it looks washed out. Why do all blockbusters look like this now?
Bring warm tones and colors back to fantasy movies.
You think Wicked looks great?
Not gray, dull.
Now, I'm not here to be a hater, but
such
as
a
much
shame
as we all love
But the
Wicked,
color grading and the lighting.
Their complaints stemmed from like the first trailer and early promotional images, but after Wicked premiered,
I saw the Wicked movie.
the discourse schismed for some reason in a more confusing way. Some watchers thought the movie was actually incredibly vibrant.
I can't even describe the joy that I felt when I watched it.
Sparking a whole new meme format of people making fun of the color grade nitpickers, but other watchers still thought the movie was too desaturated.
I find the movie like at times unwatchable because of the way that the CGI, the production design, and the colorization of the movie intersects. The way that this movie is colored like makes me want to hurt myself.
Which made me question, what is happening? Like, didn't we all watch the same movie? Today, I want to dive into some of the production history of The Wizard of Oz and why its coloring was so beloved by audiences and just what the hell happened with Wicked. In this day and age, I feel like everyone needs a website, whether to be an artistic portfolio or a storefront for your side hustle. And Squarespace makes it super easy to build one. They have tons of templates to choose from, and they're organized based on what your needs are, though they also have customization options so you never have to feel limited. To aid you in growing your business, Squarespace offers comprehensive analytic breakdowns so you can see who's checking you out and for how long they're spending on your page, where they're based, etc. And as I said, Squarespace offers online storefront capabilities as well. You can easily list physical or downloadable products and services with just a few clicks. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Mina to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
People throw around the word Technicolor a lot in these discussions because The Wizard of Oz was filmed in Technicolor. Technicolor is a company that was founded in 1915, and they're most famous for their 3-strip color process that was used in a number of films from the 1930s to 1950s, including The Adventures of Robin Hood, Meet Me in St. Louis, and Black Narcissus. The Technicolor 3-strip process created bright reds, deep blues and greens, and highly controlled contrast between lights and darks. I'll explain how the Technicolor 3-strip process worked. If you get lost, it's okay. You don't need to know, but this is just for people who are interested in this kind of stuff. So you would record a scene on 3 separate rolls of black and white film. The camera had a special prism and a filter system to split the incoming light into its red, green, and blue components. Once the 3 films were developed, each served as a record of one primary color in the scene. These records were used to create color matrices, which were strips of film coated with a special emulsion that captured the intensity of each color. These matrices acted like stamps, so after they were loaded with dyes, they were pressed into blank film stock in sequence. The dye was absorbed by the stock, creating a dye transfer print. The final result was stunning. The prints had fine grain, rich and vibrant colors, deep blacks, and excellent contrast. Plus, the process was meticulously monitored in the lab to catch any flaws like dust or scratches. But capturing those initial color records required using the very giant, bulky Technicolor camera. One of the cameras used for The Wizard of Oz specifically was the DF-24 camera, invented in 1932. It was 106 inches high on a wheeled sled, almost 6 feet long, and weighed about 77 pounds. On top of how cumbersome it was, Technicolor only built 29 of these cameras for use in the US. So if more than one color film was shooting at the same time, cast and crew sometimes had to wait their turn for equipment, delaying the filming process. To make things even more inefficient, Technicolor didn't sell these cameras. Instead, the studios had to rent them. And once they were done for the day, the Technicolor technician would take the cameras back to the Technicolor plant each night, where every camera was then taken apart and cleaned for the next day. Shooting on film also required a lot of exterior light because there was no way to check the footage during the shooting process. This was before the days of digital. If by the time you got to developing the film, you realized that everything was just way too dark and nothing was visible, it was too late. The set was wrapped up, we've moved on. So filmmakers would flood the sets with these lights to ensure that they were going to capture something. For The Wizard of Oz, 150 arc lamps were used to brighten the interior sets, raising temperatures to a super comfortable 100 degrees or more. Honestly, do not know how the Cowardly Lion survived.
Shucks, folks, I'm speechless.
There's also a fire inspector on set every day of the shooting because of the heat of the lamps, and also because of the highly flammable nitrate film that was used at the time. Nitrate film, by the way, is more flammable than gasoline. Ray Bolger, the actor who played the Scarecrow, said later, "The Wizard of Oz was one of the most difficult jobs I've ever done. It was just physical work and under very trying circumstances. We were using 1,000-foot candle power with hot light and chewing up the oxygen in the studio." But these are the costs to get such a beautiful looking film. In real life, the ruby slippers are a dark burgundy shade. I actually got to see them in Tokyo because they were doing some exhibit there. But they pop on screen thanks to the powerful lighting. However, it wasn't just the color saturation that made The Wizard of Oz such a beautiful movie. Color was tricky at the time. I mean, color is still tricky, but you know, I digress. Higher saturation on its own couldn't guarantee an amazing viewing experience. One film that was panned by critics, in part for its distracting use of color, was the 1935 movie Becky Sharp.
This specially prepared scene of Miriam Hopkins as Becky Sharp shows her transformed from phantom shadows into the breathless beauty of living color by the greatest achievement in motion pictures since the advent of sound.
To be fair, this was the first movie to use Technicolor's new 3-strip process. But regardless, the New York Times described in the review how even the most delightful of colors will display the most detestable tendencies given the opportunity. What was so lovely about The Wizard of Oz was how meticulous and purposeful the coloring choices were. The most obvious example is the dramatic change from sepia to color once Dorothy leaves Kansas and enters Oz. In the book that the movie is based on, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, author L. Frank Baum had written less than 1,000 words of Dorothy's time in Kansas. However, the first screenwriter for the film adaptation, Herman Mankiewicz, wrote a 17-page treatment on the Kansas sequence alone and detailed, before a word of the script had been written, by the way, this is how locked in they were, that the Kansas shots should be filmed in black and white. And quote, every effort should be made through tinting to emphasize the gray nature of the landscape and Dorothy's daily life. In the end, the Kansas sequences were filmed in black and white, but then the film was placed in a brown bath to take away the harshness of the black and white and give it its sepia tinge that we see on screen today. Another example, in the original novel, Dorothy's magical footwear was silver, and this was a detail that they actually kept in the Wicked movie because of copyright issues. But when it came to the movie adaptation, The Wizard of Oz, it was screenwriter Noel Langley who was credited for penning the shoes as ruby slippers in his draft. There's not a confirmed reason why the shoes were switched to red. It's possible that Langley intuitively thought red would pop more magically in Technicolor, but also to note, silver was unpredictable in Technicolor and required a bluish tinge to photograph properly. If not precise, the silver hue would be swallowed up and canceled out against a yellow brick road. And the yellow brick road would have had priority as a constant set element because yellow could vary if the intensity of lighting was inconsistent. So it's also totally possible that the ruby slippers were chosen over silver slippers as a result of preliminary color testing. The film's art director, Randall Duell, said, color film wasn't perfected then. We had to do a lot of testing and experimenting with the film to get the colors to reproduce properly. We'd start filming a set a week or two before it was going to be used. We had to color test each set, not only for the paints on the set, but for the background. Part of the yellow brick road was a painted backing, a backdrop. If that backdrop wasn't painted and lit properly, it would look like a painted backdrop. And speaking of backdrops, this was a fun fact. The cornstalks in the Scarecrow set were initially authentic cornstalks, but they withered under the intense lighting. So the cornstalks were thrown away and replaced with a more robust celluloid cornfield. Then one of the directors, George Cukor, suggested adjustments to soften the backdrop to make it look more naturalistic and to add a row of fences in diminishing perspective to create more depth. The end result for all this hard work was a beautiful, vivid movie with directional choices that were incredibly well thought out. So, why don't we still use Technicolor today? Technicolor eventually lost out to competition from other color processes. By 1954, most color films made in the US were being shot in Eastman color or Ansco color. Eastman color and other similar processes were cheaper and therefore more appealing to studios. Also, new widescreen systems could not be used with Technicolor's 3-strip process.
The new VistaVision film negative, twice as big, twice as clear as the old-style negative.
Technicolor ended up retiring its 3-color cameras, and in the 1960s, the company diversified its options and entered the consumer market. While Technicolor always had its limitations, Richard Haines writes in his book, Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing, that the Eastman color prints look good, but not glorious. The dyes were not as vibrant as in the Technicolor process, and blacks were pretty transparent. Technicolor copies also aged better, whereas all negatives and prints made in Eastman color prior to 1983 faded. The long-standing saturation of Technicolor helped cement, I think, The Wizard of Oz as one of the most colorful movies in our collective imagination, and which evidently sets an incredibly high standard for any Oz adaptation that follows it.
D for dull and for depressing, dismal and dead.
But these days, it seems like the movies coming out are so flat and drab that any kind of film stock is more desirable than what we have now. As Emily St. James wrote for Vox in 2022, so many TV shows and movies now have a dull filter applied to every scene, one that cuts away vibrancy and trends towards a boring sameness. Every frame's color scheme ends up feeling the same as every other frame. And when there are so many projects using similar techniques, you end up with a world of boring visuals that don't stand out. Similar complaints about color dullness and bad lighting have plagued the internet over the last few years, emphasized in one of my favorite memes. Men in LA, get off your phones and stop being influencers. We need gaffers. These shows dark as hell. I can't see shit. As another example, Twitter user Katie Stebbins posted a side-by-side comparison of screenshots from season 1 of Dexter, which aired in 2006, and the new Dexter limited series, which came out in 2021. The 2006 screen cap is much more vibrant. There's way more depth in contrast. Meanwhile, the 2021 screen cap is pale, low contrast, and Michael C. Hall's skin is tinged an inhuman shade of yellow-green. He looks a little jaundiced. It's easy to think that the reason movies looked better back in the day was because they were shot on film. Season 1 of Dexter was actually shot on film. But digital is not totally at fault. I love film just as much as everyone, but there's been plenty of beautifully colored digital projects like Moonlight, Midsummer, Dune, and The Holdovers, the last one which replicated the old school film look pretty accurately, I think. So it's not the medium itself, it's the process of how we use the medium. As I said before, the reason why early sets were flooded with light was because there was no way to know how the film would look until it was already developed. So to be safe and to save money, film sets employed a lot of light. But when you're shooting digital, you're able to see how the footage is looking in real time. While this allows more freedom, shooting on digital can sometimes be a crutch for filmmakers. They don't have to be as meticulous with their lighting, set design, and shot composition anymore because everything can be reshot a million times and or tweaked later on in post-production. Cinematographer Shasta Spahn explained how inexperience or laziness can fuck up night scenes pretty easily. She said, "The sensors on the camera are so sensitive and they have so much latitude now, I would say it's easy for people who don't have much experience to go out in the dark and shoot a scene and think they've mastered it. But it still requires knowledge of the color grade, scale, exposure, and knowing what your limits are. Night scenes can be done and are done so beautifully, but they're also done so poorly." There's also just been a larger trend throughout the 2010s towards darkly lit projects because it carries connotations of grit and seriousness. Cinematographer Christian Springer also told Vox that film actually is naturally less saturated than digital, outside of Technicolor, and filmmakers might be making their productions dark because they want to replicate a film vibe. It sounds confusing, but let me read what he said because he says it so much better than I do. When digital cameras showed up, they naturally had more saturation and more pop to them. For a while there, everything we saw was super saturated and super poppy. If you go to Best Buy to buy television, you're looking at these incredible color demos of the most colorful colors possible. I think a lot of filmmakers almost see that as an antithesis to cinema. If you really look back on a lot of cinema history, a lot of things are not overly colorful and saturated like that. So I think people are pulling that back to try to make digital a little bit more like film. The director of Wicked, John Chu, echoed these ideas when asked why he made his film more desaturated than the original Wizard of Oz. He said, there's color all over it. I think what we wanted to do was immerse people into Oz to make it a real place. Because if it was a fake place, if it was a dream in someone's mind, then the real relationships and the stakes that these two girls are going through wouldn't feel real. I think this is a similar thought process for some of the live action Disney remakes like The Little Mermaid and Peter Pan and Wendy. I guess the filmmakers want to make the live action version seem a bit more real than their fun, colorful 2D counterparts. That choice doesn't really make any sense to me because their target audience is still children, but I digress. But for Wicked, I sort of get what she was saying. Wicked is supposedly the adult, real story of the Wizard of Oz that captures the underlying political turmoil of Oz and offers commentary on the nuances of good versus evil. The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's version, on the other hand, is an idealized world experienced over a relatively short period of time by a 12-year-old girl. Her vision of Oz would always be more colorful in comparison to her home in Kansas. But for Elphaba and Galinda, Oz is the only place that they know. There is no bland Kansas to juxtapose. And not to play devil's advocate with myself, I also think that the Wicked musical provides a lot of fan service to the original Wizard of Oz.
The melody of the Unlimited theme is actually the first 7 notes of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which is...
And this became even more evident to me when I looked at the original Wicked book that it's based on. So the Wicked book is a 500-plus page monster that mostly focuses on the political and religious turmoil in the land of Oz rather than the character relationships. It's a revisionist tale and diverges quite a lot from the Wizard of Oz canon.
Bach took stock, as best his stumbling mind could manage, an erect tiger in hip boots and a cape.
What? Okay.
The musical adaptation, on the other hand, seamlessly aligns itself with The Wizard of Oz and acts essentially as like a parallel story just from a different perspective. I'm going to give out a few spoilers, so skip to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled for the book or for the rest of the musical. In the musical screenplay, the character Bach becomes the Tin Man, and the character Fiyero becomes the Scarecrow. But in the book, the Tin Man's true identity is like a random side character that doesn't even get like one speaking line, and the Scarecrow's true identity is never revealed. In the musical, Madame Morrible conjures the tornado that brings Dorothy to Oz, whereas in the book, the tornado's creation is never discussed. It just sort of like appears. Meanwhile, major plot points in the book that don't coincide with the Wizard of Oz canon, like Elphaba having a son, Nessa Rose's religious tyranny, the political tension between Munchkinland and the rest of Oz, and Fiyero's family life, are omitted from the musical completely. Obviously, there wouldn't have been enough time to adapt everything from the book, but I'm just saying that the details chosen or rewritten were details that could be more appreciated by an audience who has seen and loved The Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz reference!
Now, I think if they adapted the original book into a completely new movie screenplay, it would make more sense to go for a gritty color palette because the book is also much more violent and sexual and written for adults. Like, Dr. Stillman gets murdered in the book. But the musical screenplay, on the other hand, is pretty lighthearted and PG. All is to say, because of these fan service choices, many people's love for the Wicked musical goes hand in hand with their love for The Wizard of Oz. And so I think employing a Technicolor color palette would have made more sense for just like basic audience enjoyment. And yes, even though the Technicolor 3-strip process no longer exists, modern filmmakers have been able to achieve a similar effect in movies like The Love Witch and Pearl.
I can make it better.
Come on, I'm sorry. It's time to go.
No, I'm a star!
Come on.
I also think it's possible to tell a serious story in a colorful way. Shoot me. For example, La La Land has stunning use of color that referenced old Hollywood films, but was still grounded in realism with pretty complex relationships. This is also me being sort of nitpicky, admittedly, and exploring why so many people had strong feelings on the color grading. Because, for the most part, I actually thought the film looked really good. Like, the only glaring thing were the aggressive lens flares, but otherwise in my theater, all the visuals were pretty saturated. Maybe it's because I had just like such low expectations. I was literally expecting to walk into a movie and see just like so much beige. And there was some beige. But, I thought there were also colors too. I'm also not a special effects expert, but I thought the visual effects and the production sets were pretty spectacular. Most of the problems I had were with the camera work. Like, theoretically, I loved the tornado wheel, as Chu called it. That was in the library of Shiz University. But the camera moved so fast around the dance numbers, and there were just so many cuts, which I think was just an injustice to the choreography because it was hard to see what a complete dance number looks like. Plus the backlighting for Dancing Through Life was pretty egregious. Compare this scene to the dance numbers in Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, and you can see how smooth yet still dynamic the camera work is in the latter. As I said, I thought the actual movie was pretty saturated, at least compared to the promotional images and the trailer. So what was the reason for this discrepancy? And why in general are people having varying experiences at the movie theater? John Chu actually told Variety that the early images he posted were not fully edited yet. He said, "It was so early and we had just started shooting. I wanted images that were evocative and provocative to show it's not some bright poppy story. We didn't even have the effects done. The background was blue. I had to have VFX put in the sky. I was coloring it on my iPhone. We're not doing this through a real process. I love playing in the shadows, but I did have my iPhone brightness very high. When I released the photos literally from my iPhone, I realized, oh, everybody really doesn't turn up their brightness that high. I felt bad because I did that. There was no going through the studio." So, long story short, those images were never indicative of what the final color grading was going to look like. But it did pique my interest that he mentioned his iPhone screen brightness, and it got me into thinking about how the screen you watch a movie on absolutely affects the colors. Once again, I thought Wicked was a pretty vibrant movie. not Technicolor vibrant, but vibrant enough, and far from drab like that screenshot from Dexter I shared earlier. But even still, I saw some complaints on Twitter and Reddit where people who also went to see the movie in theaters said that the color grading was dull. I came across this really informative Vulture article by Lane Brown, who reported on the recent state of movie theater projections that I think might come into play here. Some of the problems come down to theaters being broke thanks to the pandemic closing them for a year, but also he mentioned some long-standing problems that started back in 2009. Around this time, theaters swapped their film projectors for digital ones made primarily by Sony. The reason for switching to digital was that studios could save money by distributing movies over the internet instead of mailing around heavy film prints, and theaters could program these digital projectors to run on their own without human projectionists starting up and switching reels. However, these digital projectors do degrade over time. The ultraviolet light from the projector's lamp slowly destroys the imaging device, and the result is that the projected image loses color. The solution then is to replace the imaging devices once or twice a year, but this is expensive, so many theaters just don't do it. Also in 2020, Sony actually announced it was exiting the cinema projection business and ended support recently on models used by major chains. The projector bulbs are also only supposed to be used for about 1,000 to 5,000 hours, depending on their wattage. But since one bulb costs about $1,500, a lot of theaters will push them past their lifespans. It also costs money to replace the bulbs because they are highly pressurized, and if they break, they'll explode. The bulb also darkens over its lifetime because of the soot buildup inside, which once again affects picture quality. Digital Cinema Initiatives, a joint venture between major film studios, recommends that commercial theaters project their films at a minimum of 14 foot Lamberts, a standard of brightness. But one maintenance technician told Brown that some places with old Sonys are getting as few as 6 foot Lamberts. In addition, 3D filters like the one in Ant-Man can darken a movie to 4 foot Lamberts. Theaters will often compensate by installing these high-gain screens with silver coatings, which reflect more light, but results will vary depending on where you're seated. For example, if you're sitting in the middle, the screen will appear pretty luminous, but if you're sitting on the side, the picture may be only half as bright. And on top of all those factors, many of the projectionists that Brown interviewed also complained about the masking of multiplexes, aka the hiding of the borders of the screen. Some movie theaters, like the one that I went to, will have motorized curtains that will cover unused portions of the screen space. But theaters without curtains will just let their pictures spill over the edges or adjust their projectors to crop the movies themselves, which costs viewers both light and resolution. The other problem with having no curtains is that there's nothing protecting the screen. Cleanup crews, I don't know if you've seen them, but they tend to come in and use leaf blowers to clean up a theater, and bits of popcorn will go flying and get stuck on the screen. Genevieve Hivemeyer-King, a projectionist and a senior digital collection specialist at the Library of Congress, told Brown, "I've seen dead bugs on the port glass that create shadows big enough to make an entire image darker." Brown reports that AMC announced plans to install laser projectors in all its US theaters by 2026. And these machines, we can look forward to them because they offer better brightness, colors, and contrast than standard digital projectors, and they can run for 20,000 hours before their light systems need replacing. So I imagine the theater that you saw Wicked in would affect your viewing experience quite a lot. There are, of course, a large number of people who don't go to theaters at all and are waiting for Wicked and other movies to come out on streaming services. This poses its own problems, notably caused by video compression. So for a show or movie to make its way over the internet, I don't know why I did this, make its way over the internet, it has to be compressed, aka its file size has to be reduced. However, compression can significantly reduce video quality, especially if you have slow connection or limited bandwidth. Your TV also affects how things will show up. Dark scenes are generally more difficult to properly display, so if your TV doesn't have great black levels, the black colors get crushed and you lose detail. But if the black levels are too high, the dark images can end up looking washed out. Lane Brown actually wrote another article about TV definition, and he notes that when he watched older movies on his 4K TV, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, the viewing experience was very detailed and sharp. But when he watched newer movies on it, like The Revenant, Thor Ragnarok, and Godzilla vs. Kong, there was noticeable blurriness. Much of the problem comes down to the simple fact, which is CGI. I'm not sure what happened in the case with Wicked, but most CGI is still rendered at 2K, which is about a quarter as sharp as 4K. So if a movie is getting remastered into 4K for home viewing, the live action footage gets downgraded first to 2K to match the digital elements, and then the combined product is upscaled to 4K. On the other hand, many old movies are shot on film with practical effects that were also shot on film. 35mm roughly has the native resolution of 4K already, so everything just looks good. When it comes to movies like Robert Eggers' The Northman, which includes both practical and CGI effects, the practical sequences you'll notice tend to look much better than the CGI sequences. Eggers himself discussed the 4K version of his movie. He said he's mostly happy with it because the 4K version actually has a more specific dialed-in color grade than the theatrical version. However, when it comes to the CGI effects, like the second shot of the movie when the Viking crafts approach the Icelandic shore, Eggers says, "I think it's really strong, but I only buy it 97%. When those ships come in, that doesn't totally work for me." So, if studios know that TVs are streaming 4K now, why not render the CGI effects in 4K? Well, major streaming services typically demand 4K CGI nowadays, but according to co-founder of the VFX studio Bluebolt, Angela Barson, 4K takes much longer to render, and with all the existing scheduling difficulties of the CGI process, corners are cut. And as a result, a half-assed 4K effect can actually look worse than a decent 2K one. Also, the process of making CGI effects in the first place is so complex and highly skilled, and 4K TVs also display a higher contrast between darks and lights, which makes bad CGI look even more noticeable. Barson says you have to make sure the CGI matches its surroundings completely throughout the full color gamut. It's an art form and not everybody can do it. It requires experts, and there are not enough of them in the world. After reading this, I also started to wonder whether a lot of big budget blockbuster movies have flat coloring because it's easier for them to blend the CGI into the movie than to do high contrast, dynamic coloring. And then after I had that train of thought, I thought about how Wicked used mostly practical sets with some CGI incorporation. Maybe it's possible that they reduced the contrast in the color grading to help blend the CGI with the practical elements. However, since big budget films that rely heavily on CGI often look visually flat, as I said before, audiences have come to associate that flatness with CGI. And as a result, I think the practical effects in the movie don't appear as real or as striking on screen as they do in behind the scenes photos where there's sharper contrast. I'm talking about all this for 30 something minutes now, right? I don't wear a watch, but I assume it's about 30 something minutes. And admittedly, I've never been a huge stickler for quality. I also have just a very strong memory of watching Cloverfield on my friend's iPod Touch on the school bus in 15-minute commuting intervals over the course of several days. I was raised on small square-shaped TVs, scratched-up DVDs that glitched every so often, cheap projectors propped up in college dorms, and laptop screens that are never as clean as they should be. Over time, I like to think that my tastes have improved somewhat, and I've grown more desire to respect directors and cinematographers' artistic visions and watch their movies in theaters like a good cinephile. So yes, this is my journey at the moment. But sometimes I wonder how many people are actually this anal about color grading and lighting, and how many people just wanted to hate on this project so bad because it's a musical or because the press tour was doing too much.
Holding space with that. Yeah. That's what I wanted.
Or because of their personal hatred towards Ariana Grande for her reported homewrecking on the Wicked set, or for the way that she's just been looking these days. Maybe it's because popular projects will always get the most criticism, or maybe it's because we've now gotten the vocabulary to talk about these issues. Or maybe we all just finally lost it. We've reached a breaking point. We're tired of hearing about these movies taking up hundreds of millions of dollars to deliver a subpar result. Not saying Wicked is subpar, but just, speaking on a general level. We're tired of paying rising movie ticket prices to see these subpar results and deal with these subpar movie projections. And maybe because of all this so-called technological progress we're making as a society, we expect to see something that looks more phenomenal than what was shown on screen in 1939. And maybe the fact that we aren't, it's reaffirming our deep-seated premonition that new tech, AI, smartphones, etc., is all kind of evil.
It's such a sadness that you think you've seen a film on your f***ing telephone. Get real.
Or maybe I'm just projecting. Anyways, my name is Mina Lay. Thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you next time. Bye.